那我们这次很荣幸又邀请到就 Justin Ma 来为大家讲解就是 FTL 与就是 Into the Breach 的设计经验谈。那我们大家就是掌声欢迎他。
Hi, everybody. So my name is Justin Ma. I created the company Subset Games with Matthew Davis. We've done 2 games so far, as she said, FTL, the top one, and Into the Breach, the lower. I did the majority of the game art. Matt did all the coding, and we worked together on design. Everything else was done by our super talented contractors. So FTL started out as a fun little side project, and it eventually gained tons of notoriety worldwide, something that we weren't really expecting. So it's a spaceship simulation game. We tried to make you feel like you're the captain giving orders to your crew. It took us about 2 years to complete, and we continued to work on it after we released it for about 2 years. After the success of FTL, we took our time with Into the Breach, and it was a very long process, which I'll go into shortly. So this talk is mostly about Into the Breach. What is it? It is a tactics game, so picture Final Fantasy Tactics or even chess. But the big difference is that you know exactly what the enemy is going to do before they do it. So in this GIF, for example, you can see that the top enemy, I have this. Boop, that guy, he's going to attack this building here with this red line showing you doing 1 damage, and he's going to attack this building there. So this is what happens in this GIF is if you do nothing on your turn, they are going to execute their actions and attack the buildings. So what do? You get to act before they act. So in this example, my punchy mech here guy, he punches this monster, which moves him over 1 tile, and now he's attacking his own ally. So in 1 action, I was able to prevent 2 attacks going to the same building. And the enemies are not smart. There's a really terrible AI, and your goal is basically to use their stupidness against themselves. And so what I mean by no outcome randomness is that there's no hit chances, there's no critical chances, there's no missing. If you think what's shown is going to happen, 100%. And so that's what no outcome randomness means. So other than the combat, it is a very simplistic series of short battles, one after another, with very little downtime. In it, you can, between battles, you can upgrade your mechs, improve your pilots over time, and get new equipment, that sort of thing. And then each game that you play ends up being very different. There is sort of inspiration from roguelikes to have procedural generation and some permadeath. Also, the story revolves around time travel. So at the end of the game, you send one of your pilots back in time to start over in a new version of that world. Whether or not you win or lose, someone goes back in time, hopefully. So to understand some of the choices that we made during development, it's kind of useful to know our mindset going in. We had just finished a very successful game. We had a ton of fans and had enough money to fund our next game without any worry. We're a very small team. We don't own a studio. It's very cheap. But we're not very business-minded, so we didn't want to just grow and hire people. We didn't want to work on FTL 2. We were kind of just exhausted, and we wanted to remember why making games is fun. Why are we doing this? So when we started this project, we had a few rules in mind. We didn't want to deal with the pressure of making something bigger and better than FTL. So from the start, I just tried to accept that this game would not be as big. It's just what's going to happen. We tried to focus on what Matt and I were good at. So this is why we didn't use Unity. This is why it's in 2D pixel art. It was largely just us trying to work with our skills. And we were also committed to find a game that we really liked. If we hit a dead end and we couldn't find something fun, we would just throw out the project. This is why we didn't announce the game or tell anyone about it for 3 years or so. It was because we just didn't want to have expectations or promises that people had. And we wanted to feel like we could throw it out if it doesn't work. And of course, we also did not want to kill ourselves working on the game. We crunched very hard with FTL, and we wanted to avoid that. We wanted to take weekends off, see our family, eat food, you know. So Into the Breach, we started with a very simple, basic design. We knew that it was going to be a tactics game that had giant mechs fighting giant monsters. After seeing movies like Superman, we were tired of media where the whole city would be destroyed and no one really cared. It was just fluff to make it seem exciting. We wanted a game where you felt like it was important to protect people. And very basically, we wanted to have tough decisions. Sometimes it was worth letting your people die to save a building, and sometimes it may be worth destroying a building to save the world. So these were the core principles that stuck throughout the entirety of development. But you may notice there isn't really a game here. There's just a couple ideas. So what is the rest of the game? Is it a huge campaign? Is it really short? Is it a ton of mechs, or is it just one mech? We spent over 2 years, about 2.5 years, trying to figure out what the game would be. So, introduction to Into the Breach. This talk is going to be 2 sections. The first section is going to be focusing on how Into the Breach evolved over the time, and then the second part will be about sort of lessons that we learned and maybe tips that you guys can take from that. It's mostly going to focus about design. So this is a very simple timeline of how the design of the game evolved throughout time. The details, they're not really important. It's just something to give you a sense of how we tried something, it didn't work. We tried something else, it didn't work. And as you can see, there was multiple times that we would spend 6 months on something, find out it doesn't work, and then just cut it entirely. So this part of the talk, I'm mostly focusing on the first 2.5 years of the 4-year development, where Matt and I, with some few key testers, we sort of figured out what we wanted the game to be. And it was after this period, you know, we had to actually finish the game, which was also hard, but there was a lot less sort of dramatic changes in the design during that last year or so. So I'm going to go over each of the main design shifts, but of course each one could probably be a talk on them on its own, so it's just going to be like a brief summary. So the earliest version of the game was a simple turn-based battle on a grid. It had sort of Final Fantasy X-like turn-based system. Each unit would go in their order. The actions just happened immediately. It wasn't very interesting or unique. The first big turning point, this is what the actual game looked like. The left one is like a concept art, I guess. So the big turning point was when we realized that telegraphed attacks were fun. And what telegraphed attacks I mean is being able to see what the enemy intends to do or plans to do before that they get to do it. So this was the first enemy that had it. The twos there are what it's going to be attacking. And once we had him in the game and we started realizing it was fun, we added it to every enemy and the game got way more interesting. From there, we switched to a sort of basic isometric view. And then after that, when we were realizing this could be an actual game, it became clear how hard the user interface is going to be. We had a game where you have to know everything that's going to happen at all times. You have to know what the player's movement range is, what your attacks do, which enemy is doing which attack. Everything had to be perfectly clear just at a glance. And so that necessity of a clear UI shaped a lot of the gameplay and forced the gameplay to be small and simple. So the fact that most every weapon can only fire in like a straight line, that's because of the UI. It would be too hard to explain things. And I could probably give a whole talk about the UI because that was just miserable. But I'll just ignore that for the rest of this talk. It's fine. So at this point, we knew that we liked the combat system enough to actually make a game out of it, but big questions still remained. What is the rest of the game? How do you progress? How do you win or lose? What do you do in between battles? That was a very long, gradual process of trial and error. The first pass at the metagame, which is the things in between battles, The first pass was this very large map that had a whole bunch of small nodes. These are just mock-ups. This isn't the real game. But so all these little nodes and stuff, each one of those would represent a different small city. So in this version, you would manage many different squads trying to hold back the enemy as they sort of spread around the large map. Each of these circles, like I said, is a different small map, and the enemies could take them over and you could fight them in it or take it back or repair and stuff like that. We wanted to have a interesting strategy layer, sort of like XCOM, where you were managing your income from the cities and researching new technology and all that sort of fun stuff. So when we tried doing it, we ran into a whole ton of problems. Because the map was so big and the cities, you see them so infrequently, there was too many cities to care about. You actually stopped, the destruction of one area didn't feel impactful at all. You stopped caring, basically. It also just simply wasn't fun to chase enemies around the map. That just was boring. There weren't really interesting choices. You just take a step, they would take a step. It's boring. We knew that for the player to get invested and actually care about the upgrades, that you would actually have to be a pretty long game in general. And we knew that we wanted it to be shorter than FTL instead of, you know, a 10-hour campaign or something. So we knew we had to change something. So from this point, we tried to keep the same idea, but go on a smaller scale. Threats, so in this version, threats would appear in different regions, and you basically would decide whether or not you wanted to go protect a region or save your energy and that sort of thing. Also, there was no walking. You would just instantly teleport to a new area to fight it. So we wanted, like I said with the previous version, we wanted you to have a stronger connection with the city. Enemies would take over an area, but because there's fewer of them, you'd sort of recognize it and realize, you know, how it's changing over time. We also knew that we wanted to have FTL, sort of FTL-like events, where there'd be text environmental descriptions of things that are happening, and you could send your units on missions and stuff like that. And similar, we still had this whole system where you were managing a ton of different systems: income, population, the buildings, repairing, tech research, all this sort of things, and different squads. So the left image here was the first pass. We switched to a smaller 8-region area, but even that we realized that you just wouldn't recognize the places because there's still too many. So then we shifted to the right image where we basically forced you to see the whole map at all times. And we actually worked on that version for a very long time until we decided it wasn't very fun. So this was getting better. It was more interesting, but there was still a number of problems. It was overly complicated, but there was actually very few interesting decisions. Honestly, it wasn't certain if what you were doing was a good strategy or not. You couldn't tell when your actions actually made a benefit. The result of your action could take an hour before you see what happens. And that caused a problem that you could see in a game like XCOM, the original XCOM, where the enemy gets harder and harder, and if you don't keep up with the enemy, you'll actually get in a position where you've already lost the game. You just don't know it, and you'll discover that you lost the game 5 hours later. And that is just not a fun situation, so we tried to avoid that as much as possible. So we ended up sticking with this design for a while, but eventually we decided it just wasn't working. We were basically making 2 boring games instead of 1 interesting game. So this was the big turning point in the game's design. We spent basically a year or so unsuccessfully trying to make the metagame strategy fun. But we knew that the combat was interesting, so we basically decided to turn the game entirely into combat. Just throw out anything that is not the combat. So at this point, we knew that we wanted to focus entirely on battles, so we tried just making it a series of fights in a row. Like I said, anything that didn't fit with this new idea of what the game should be, we just got rid of it, no matter how much we cared. But I wanted to be simpler, but we still wanted there to be interesting choices that have costs and benefits. So we wanted there to be something that you still can feel like you're making decisions in this strategy layer. So we were on the right direction, but there were still a lot of questions. How do we make the choices between missions interesting? It was a hard thing to figure out. And how do you make it balanced so that these choices, there wasn't obviously one that was better than another? And then the general, how do you pace the game? How many battles do you have? When do you win? How often can you repair? And that sort of thing. So in the left example, we have you basically pick one mission out of it. It gives you 2 random missions, and you pick one of the 2, and then just a series of that in a row. Later, we decided that we would try and bring it back to a map, even if we kept it simple. And so we'd give you those 2 options from a list of 10 or whatever. And in those, each one of these locations ends up being a useful asset, the building. So, for example, if you rescue this area, it would give all of your mechs +1 movement. And if you were able to successfully protect it, you would lose the other one. So there was this sort of decision-making of what skills do I want to have going forward based on which areas that I pick. So around this point, for other reasons, we switched the game to occurring on these small islands. This is for thematic and story reasons. Each island had its own terrain and features, and once you save one island, you would just go to another one before whatever the end would be. So the islands were divided into different regions. Each has their own random mission, and when you completed one, the adjacent regions, the regions next to it, would become available with new missions. So this helped the design in a number of ways. Having random mission objectives mean that each time you went to the island, it felt very different. You can also see the potential rewards of a mission at a glance. That was highly important to us to make it very clear in both of these versions, even though they're quite different what the rewards are. You could see what it is just from the island view. And there was still short-term decision-making. Do I pick this one or this one? And there was also long-term decision-making of if I choose this harder mission, I could potentially get to a better mission later and further on in the island. It wasn't very complex, but it at least was a decision. So we were generally happy with this design, but there were some problems and challenges to get it to be right. Similarly, how do you balance the difficulty and rewards? So even in the left one, you can see the sort of asset idea, gaining +1 reactor for all mechs. Eventually, we decided that that was too hard to actually balance. Some things were just clearly better than others. So we actually made all the rewards very, very simplistic and frankly more boring. But it made for a much more balanced game. So in the right one, which is the closer to the final game, you could see it's just like you can gain power or money or upgrade, and that's it. There's nothing else. But there was still a decision making in there, so it was good enough. So we eventually found a design that we liked, but this whole process of this metagame thing was very long and very hard, and we had to very often give up on something that we tried very hard to make interesting and we thought was a really good idea, and we just have to get rid of it. We, of course, had that option because our first game had enough, made enough money that we could just keep working this way, that we were very fortunate in that way. But that didn't make the decision-making any easier. So this is the end of the evolution of the game's metagame design, but I still want to talk about a few more features that were particularly interesting. I forgot how to finish the island without doing all missions. Basically, the players felt like they were missing out if they couldn't go to each of the regions, and we had to figure out some way to do that. So, like I mentioned before, we spent a lot of time trying to make FTL events work. So these are a text event, something pops up, something happened, refugees are coming, that sort of thing, and you have a couple different options. And the options would change based on the equipment and the pilots that you have. This general design, it helps add a lot of atmosphere and character by only adding text. It's not too much work to do it. They also add randomness in a way that you can sort of strategize around. It's not like a 63% chance of something. It's, you know, it's a 50-50 or something more obvious that you know that what the risks are. They also allowed us to have pilots and equipment interact with the game outside of combat. We thought just only interacting inside combat would be kind of boring. So we wanted like pilots to be able to have personality traits that would maybe, you know, if they're heroic or something, that would change the, or they're very aggressive, that would change the options that you have. But unlike FTL, where in FTL you jump to a new location and there's a new event. It just made sense. You were discovering a new location. But we ran into some problems with Into the Breach. How do we even trigger them? There's no clear time marker when you should get a new event. We would just make it happen once a week, but that just felt very random. And because they popped up randomly, it just sort of felt like it was jarring and it didn't fit with the game. We thought we would help add and create more storytelling, but it just never felt right. And because we weren't certain what it was adding to the game, it would just be a ton of work for something that we weren't certain about. So similar to the text events, we were also trying for a while on the right, this sort of deck-based system, because we love board games and we love the randomness of board games. It's a random that you can sort of work around over time and understand. And so we tried to have something like a deck of events in the game, but we scrapped it. And in fact, we scrapped all text events entirely. So another design that feature that stayed in the game for a very long time was the concept of support units. These were weaker, more traditional military units that could be killed and then replaced later. In part, they were there to make the mechs feel more powerful. We wanted to convey that this was a really new technology that came from the future. So how do you do that? You compare it directly to something much weaker. And I personally wanted them to have really interesting upgrades. You can see one of the mock-ups is like a turret and how over time you'd improve it, and it just has tons of options, and you can specialize it to be more interesting. So there was a couple core problems with having support units and all this technology and stuff in a very simple game. Balancing the abilities of the support units compared to the mechs was very hard. They needed to be useful, but not too useful. The mechs needed to feel really powerful in comparison. But what does that mean? How can the support units still be useful? It also meant that we had way more equipment and complicated systems in general. It was just a lot of stuff to have to manage. And in the end, we found it wasn't really necessary. Early on, when we had the city view, we would have the support units like located, stationed in different areas, and then they would stay there permanently. But once we switched to the sort of battle system of the simple combat, the support units didn't really have a role. Their role was filled by the mechs. Why even keep it? So besides this, there was just tons of things we were managing. The assets, the support units, we had convoy units and defenses like a turret or something. And all in all, it was just way too complicated. And we just cut everything and just focused 100% on the mechs. You may be noticing a theme here of just cutting everything in smaller and smaller. So the next issue that we struggled with was thematic wrapping. Basically, what was the story justification for the gameplay? It didn't have to make sense, but we needed to make the world feel like it fit, like there was a thematic core of the game. So we knew that you needed to buy things and upgrade your mech, but we didn't know how. Who were you buying it from? Where did they get the technology? We also knew that the destruction of the city would cause you to lose the game, but we had no idea why. We had to prove that in the game somehow. And along this path, we tried tons of things. We had morale and panic and resolve. The civilians of a city would evacuate and run away if it got too destroyed and things like that. So this was just a lot of small trial and error things, and it took a long time to find something that we liked. So we initially had something close to XCOM's research, where it takes a lot of time to get something new and that sort of thing, and it just was way too complicated for our silly little game. We tried, like I said, panic and morale and all these things, and no matter what, it just felt tacked on and arbitrary. And we knew that we had to connect the mechs function, the fact that they work, to the buildings, but so that became the core focus of the thematic wrapping. In the end, we basically tried to find something that was as simple as possible, and just so that the player would accept it and not think about it. So we cut research. Upgrades were just all unified into one thing, and we said that the mechs were connected to the city's power grid. So if the buildings were destroyed, the mechs no longer had power, and then you'd lose the game. It's not really an elegant solution, but it was good enough, and it provided the sort of function that we were hoping for. So this 2 to 3 year journey took us all over the place. How did we survive this time? Basically, we tried to stick to our original pitch as much as possible, but we would then follow anything that seemed to be the most fun. This style of development is probably only possible in very small teams. You probably couldn't just as easily cut 20 people's worth of, a year's worth of work and have everyone want to continue to work for you. But since it was just Matt and I, it was easier to just cut everything and just not worry about it. So, like I said, we tried our best to make something and basically every feature work, but in the end, nothing was safe from criticism. We try to keep an open mind to be willing to change anything in the game. This was very helpful to make it better, but it was also very stressful because you just felt like nothing was ever finished, and you felt like everything could be thrown out tomorrow. And of course, the final game was way smaller than we pictured. Maybe like 10% of what we pictured originally. We just cut and cut and cut and cut. And sometimes it didn't feel great, but sometimes it was wonderful, because if you cut 30% of the game, you are 30% closer to being done. This is yay for cutting. Okay. I didn't go into too much detail, but this is a very general progression of the evolution of the game. So now let's talk about how we made these decisions over time. I tried to spend a while to think about how Matt and I approach game design, and then I tried to take those ideas and make some sort of tips for you guys. Very often these things are just the way that we work naturally. They're not rules that we made up and then followed. It's just a reflection of how we work and the games that we like. So I'm not saying this is perfect for everybody, but maybe you could find it useful. So first I need to talk about how I personally think about design. When I think about a feature, I usually break it into two aspects, what I'm calling low-level and high-level design. Other people may have different words for this or think of them as the same thing, but I find it useful to separate them. So what I'm calling low-level design is the basic details. Yes, Mario can jump, but how high? If you tap the button versus hold the button, does he go higher or not? It's essentially what are the mechanics and what are the actual numbers. High-level design, on the other hand, is more abstract. Why does the feature exist? What role does it play? Mario's jumping isn't just the numbers, it's a movement mechanic, an attack, how you activate buttons and switches. It's also the reason why the game is fun to begin with. So a feature's high-level design, if it doesn't result in a better game, I think it's just the feature is completely pointless if you just have if it doesn't actually add something to the player's experience that's positive. So the basic difference is essentially one describes what the feature is while the other describes why it exists or how it interacts with the player. So I'll go through two examples first. Pacman or Mrs. Pacman, I assume you know it. You collect dots and then you avoid the ghosts, and every once in a while a cherry appears. So let's think about this cherry for a moment. So what's the low-level design? It appears once you get a number of points. It appears at a specific place. You get extra points if you get it, and the ghosts don't care about it, and it disappears after a short period of time. It's fairly basic understanding. So what is the high-level design? What is the role that it plays? Or at least what do I think it is? It creates a risk versus reward scenario. The cherry disappears after a short time, so is it worth trying to go for it to get the points, or do you just ignore it and try and survive? It also shakes you up. During the middle of a stage, you basically have to reconsider your strategy. You may have had a plan for this whole time, and now something else appears, and you have to think, what do I do now? And when that happens, you can often make a mistake, which is a fun thing to happen. It also increases the difference between good and bad players. It increases the skill cap. So good players can learn when they appear, and they can use that knowledge to their advantage to get a better score. Second example is the Ghost in Spelunky. If you don't know this game, it's an indie platformer. It was one of the first notable games that, at least I know of, that took the roguelike formula and took it to another genre. The game is divided into a number of different maps, and if you spend too much time in one map, a ghost will appear and chase you. What is the low-level design? It appears 2.5 minutes. It slowly moves around. It moves through walls. You can't kill it. It kills you, and it also has fun with gems. So that's how it works, but what role does the ghost play? It encourages you to go fast and throw caution to the wind. The game has tons of traps, and if you have all the time in the world, you could very easily ignore them. And so just the threat of the ghost, even if the ghost isn't there, the fact that you know it exists makes you go faster and often make mistakes. It gives you interesting choices. You don't have time to go everywhere, so you often have to pick. Do I go here or here? Do I go to the store? Do I go to the treasure chest? And that sort of thing. It reduces the feeling of grinding. Grinding is when you just have to do everything and it's not fun. So if you had no time constraint, you would basically feel like you have to go get every little piece of treasure because it would help you improve your chances of survival. But that's not fun to feel like you have to do that. So it reduces that feeling. And similarly, it also increases the skill cap for players. Good players can travel really fast and get everything before the ghost arrives. And you can even use the ghost to your advantage if you can go around him and stuff like that. So it's important to note how important the low-level design is to create the high-level design that you want. So if the ghost was a little bit slower, it came at 3 or 4 minutes, there would be no threat. You'd finish every map and no issue. If it came quicker, like a minute early, you would basically have to run all the time. So just by changing one small aspect of the low-level design, you would have completely different high-level design. So that's some examples. And knowing what the low-level design is very easy. But how do you figure out what the high-level design is? I generally like to ask questions. So just continuing with the Spelunky example. First, I ask, how does it force the player to act? It puts pressure on you to keep moving forwards. There's a large area, but you only have a limited amount of time. What would it be like if there was no ghost? You would feel completely free to take your time. You'd explore everything. Enemies would feel less dangerous. You have that grinding feeling. How does it interact with other features? So it forces you to prioritize one thing over another. And also there's a ton of traps in the game, so having more pressure works well with making mistakes and makes the game more fun generally. So on paper, just having a ghost that chases you doesn't seem like it would be that important, But if you understand the high-level design, you can see how it impacts and changes the player experience in many ways, and maybe why it's necessary. So if you think a feature in another game adds something important to its design and you want to do the same thing to your game, I suggest figuring out the high-level design and then bringing that to your game instead of the low-level design. So, for example, if you wanted the ghost and you wanted something to make the player move faster, instead of copying the ghost exactly or something, figure out something that has the same result as the ghost, causes the same feeling for the player. If you have this high-level design as your goal, it's actually a very useful metric or goalpost to compare with. You can keep changing the low-level design and basically ask the question, is it giving us the high-level design that we want? Sorry, there's a fly landed on my face. Also, if you copy, like I said earlier, if you copy the low-level design, it can actually result in a very, very different high-level design in a different game. So this is generally why I suggest copying the high-level design instead. Okay, so in my three examples here are the hunger meter in roguelikes, where if you don't eat, you die. It's pretty simple. And there's very little food, and it forces you to move quickly. The second one, Spelunky Ghost, and third one is the fleet in FTL. Basically, it was the threat of the bad guys who are chasing you, which forces you to move to the right. So these are very different mechanics, but the high-level design is basically the same thing. It prevents the player from seeing the whole map. It forces the player to have to make choices and maybe make mistakes, and it gives you a sense of foreboding the longer you stay. You start to feel nervous. So the same high-level design is created by very different mechanics. So I would say that Spelunky doesn't need the ghost, but it does need something that fulfills this high-level design. So it's useful to keep that in mind when you're trying to come up with a new mechanic to work for your game. And of course, each game has their own challenges because the low-level design is so different. Like I said, with the timing of the ghost, like the fleet has the same issue. The timing or the size or the movement, everything has their own unique problems. So as you saw in the first half of the talk, we went through tons of design iterations. Figuring out what the high-level design of a feature is one of the primary ways that Matt and me, would decide whether or not we should keep a feature or not. We would basically analyze every feature in the game and figure out what it was adding, and then cut everything that wasn't helpful. So, for example, the huge map in the left of the big city, it seemed like it was a great idea, but in actuality, it was taking away from what we wanted the game to be. Similarly, if we if we analyze every feature and we find that multiple designs have the same purpose or function, then we would combine them into one just to make the game easier to understand. Why have complexity when you don't need it? So the middle example, like we had all these different types of units, but they basically perform the same role. So we just simplified that into just equipment. And also, analyzing high-level design helps you be objective, and it helps you have distance from something that you care about. It's very hard to cut something that you spend 6 months on, but if you can very logically and very coldly decide this is not working for your game, it's helpful to sort of let go and move on. So basically, thinking about high-level design is one way that we try and be objective. Along the same lines, if you want your game to stand out, it's also very useful to question everything that is in the game that you just assume is in this type of game. So if you start figuring out the high-level design of every small feature in the game, sometimes you can come up with a new, interesting way to do something that is normally done in the same way in every other game. So ask yourself, does your RPG really need strength, intelligence, dexterity, or whatever? Do mages have to wear cloth armor? Do you you know, in shmups, do you have to have lives and continues and that sort of thing? If you analyze everything with the high-level design lens, you can actually try and figure out, is this helping the game design or not? And of course, if you can use this to come up with a new way to do something similar, it just makes your game more unique. In Braid, for example, I don't know how Jonathan Blow came up with the idea, but he basically questioned the assumption that time moves forwards. And if you start questioning even basic stuff like that, you can come up with crazy stuff and interesting new mechanics when you take nothing for granted and anything could change. But that being said, most standard design is there for a reason. There's nothing wrong with sticking with something that works. You don't have to come up with something new for everything. Usually there's a balance between giving the player something that's new and giving them something that's unfamiliar. If there's too much of one, the game is not very fun. So I just ask that you at least consider these features to see, are these necessary? Are these helpful? And if you, in the end, decide, yes, these are necessary and helpful, it's fine. Don't worry about it. So this is very obvious, perhaps, but it's super important. Try and spend your development time efficiency. It's so much effort to make a game, so you need to save your time when you can. It's very critical to know your own strengths and weaknesses. If you're not familiar with network code and you can't hire someone else, don't make a multiplayer game. Just stick. It's great to learn new programming languages, but if your goal is to release a project on time, it's better to just stick with things that you're strong with. There are so many ways that you can improve games, and it's really important to figure out what are the best ways to improve it. How do I use my time effectively? So with FTL, we had this jump animation that we did in like 10 minutes, like early on in the game, and I always wanted to change it, and I just never. And similarly, there was like 5 planets, and we never went back and changed it because people just didn't seem to care. What they cared about was more content and more interesting experiences with the game. So I basically put all of our effort into things that we thought would have the most impact in the game. And of course, you still have to ship the game in the end. So at the end of the day, sometimes it's better to have a smaller game. So this tip is a little bit more situational, and it's a little bit esoteric. So when you have a choice between 2 game designs and both would work fine, pick the one that is nicest to the player. If the game feels unfair to the player because they think this other design would work just as well, the game is just instantly unfair, and you'll never change that person's mind. And even if you give them all the reasons in the world, it doesn't matter. The game is unfair, it's a bad design, etc. I think it's way better to get the player to blame themselves whenever they make a mistake. If the player can blame the game for making a mistake, it feels unfair. But if they can only blame themselves, then I've succeeded, I guess. So in XCOM, if you walk in front of an enemy and get shot, it's your fault. But if you fire and you have a 95% chance of hitting and you miss, it's the game's fault. It's not your fault. And so you leave feeling worse. It feels like the game made a mistake, even if it didn't make a mistake. But that being said, the player is not always right. Very often, things that are unfair are necessary to the game. So this is really just for things that it could go either way. And you're like, I don't know which we should pick. Just pick the one that's nicest to the player. So examples in the left there, this is the last boss of FTL. You could destroy the boss at the same time as it destroys you. And if the boss shoots first, for example, we could just say that you lose the game. But because it doesn't hurt the game at all, it's fine. It atmospherically fits if it's a suicide mission. So just be nice. Hey, you won the game. They sacrificed themselves. In the middle example, there was a mechanic where when you kill an enemy, you can heal. And there were some very weak enemies that we didn't count as real enemies. And we didn't let you heal, but then people complained a ton about it, and we realized just let them heal. It's fine. It's the same thing. And I mentioned this earlier, but this is a bit of a different angle. But So the 95% chance to hit and you miss, that feels awful. But if you have a 5% chance of something good happens, and it happens, you feel great. So in general, if you can have randomness always be in the favor of the player, have the expectation to be something that's bad is going to happen, and then when good things are happen, they love randomness. So that's something we try to do on our games. That's why we have this grid defense mechanic that that you see on the right there. Why the number is always so low. You have to assume that it's never going to happen, and then when it happens, you're elated. So these last two things are just my personal preferences. First, if you have like a strategy game and you want the player to understand what's going on and use strategy, use low numbers whenever possible. As humans, we can only have like 7 numbers in our head at once or something like that. So if you want people to feel like they're making informed decisions, like they really have control, keep everything low. It's easier. And I think that having high numbers is actually just hiding the strategy. You're trying to make it seem interesting, but the actual strategy could be simple. So for example, your attack may do 3,000 damage. He has 10,000 health, but that's essentially the same thing as 3 hit damage and 10 health, because all that matters is how many hits. It could even be 1 damage and 4 hit points, and that it's effectively the same thing. So Mario vs. Rabbids did something pretty elegant where they had any major random event was 50% chance of happening, which is a very simple way. And that being said, if you want your game to be flashy and you don't care about high strategy or whatever, then go nuts, have billions of damage, it doesn't matter. So my second suggestion is only if you don't have like a narrative game or like a very story-driven game. I personally feel like your time is better spent crafting a believable universe than it is to add more text or have more dialogue. So, for example, the atmosphere in Hyperlight Drifter or Journey, if you know those games, were way more compelling to me than most games that have text even. And to me, that's entirely because they have a very interesting and compelling world. Even if they say nothing and you understand nothing, just the fact that it feels real is more impactful. And similarly, Metroid Fusion, if you remember it, has tons of text, but I don't think it improved the game that much, maybe like 5%. In general, it just like slowed the game down a ton. So obviously, this isn't good if you are making a very narrative game in general, but I also feel like if you could tell your story in 50% less words, do 50% less words. There's no need. If you look at RPGs like Baldur's Gate compared to new games like Pillars of Eternity, there's like 20 times as much text. And I personally just get me the game. But this is just my opinion. So these different tips were all based on how we approach and discuss design. And I wanted to give you one more example of design that we struggled with in Into the Breach. And so I'll try and show you how we would use these principles to learn from our own mistakes and try and make something better. So in FTL, we had a final boss. It was okay. Some people loved it, some people hated it. If you don't know what it was a very challenging multi-part fight. Each of the phases, there was 3, they would have different skills. One had drones, and one had boarding and such. We wanted the boss to be really well-rounded and have no particular weaknesses. It even had a few unique skills that no other enemy in the game had. Like, it would just gain shields randomly, and so it was something new you had to deal with. That's the low-level design. So what is the high-level design? Note, this is my evaluation looking back years later. This is not what we were aiming for. This is just what happened. It was a dramatic climax full of desperation, which is good. It ended up having a huge difficulty spike. You could have a very easy game and then suddenly just get completely dumped on at the end. Good players would often have to upgrade their ship, specifically trying to counter the boss. You'd have to play throughout the whole game thinking about the final boss. That's kind of awkward. Since only certain strategies could beat every phase of the flagship, instead of having more interesting strategies work, we actually reduced the amount of strategies that worked because the boss was so well-rounded. You could not, for example, win with a boarding party only, sending your crew onto their ship. However, it did cause huge positive moments for people who won, but that's usually because they spent hundreds of hours in misery and unhappiness. So when we approached the final boss design of Into the Breach, we tried to keep in mind the things that worked and try and fix the things that we thought didn't. So climactic challenge, great. The difficulty was way too hard, so we just tried to make it reasonable at least, and not just overwhelm you. We didn't like forcing you to think about the final boss throughout the whole game. We wanted you to basically be able to win with any type of strategy that works in the normal game. And we also wanted to avoid being surprised by unique mechanics right at the end of the game. We wanted to not have to feel like you have to play one whole game just to learn something new to lose and try again later, or have to look at the Wikipedia or something like that. And this last change, it's not intentional, but it happened inevitably. If we remove the challenge, the crazy difficulty of the boss, it's no longer super satisfying to defeat, which is sad, but oh well. So it actually turned out to be quite hard to find a design that fit those high-level goals. We considered tons of different things: a big scary monster that had tons of abilities, a really long battle where eggs were hatching and there's tons of monsters, or like a escape sequence, stuff like that. But if we had a single big boss, a kill this unit and you win type of mission, it kind of clashed with the core principle of the game. You spend the entire game defending people and locations, and suddenly we just ask you to kill something. That's kind of awkward and doesn't fit with the whole rest of the game. We wanted a boss that matched that feeling of protection. Since Into the Breach is solvable, it's just inherently an easier game. You have to be able to win, and because of that, it is for good players, it's easier to do well. And there's also a very thin line between something being hard and fun and just impossible for a game like this. If we just add one more enemy, suddenly you can't prevent damage and you will 100% lose. And so there's very little room to play with in getting this balance of difficulty right. Similarly, scaling the difficulty was very challenging. We had easy, normal, hard. We also let you get to the final boss at a different point, 3 different points in the game. So that would mean 9 different bosses that we have to balance the difficulty of. And so all of that made it difficult to find something that would work. So in the end, we ended up focusing on something that was similar to normal fights, but a bit more challenging and higher tension. So there was way more enemies than normal. There was no giant new boss, but there was also environmental dangers like lava and stuff to help make it easier to kill all of the enemies. Your primary goal was to protect a bomb, which would go off if you defended it for long enough. This sort of defense equals victory, just live long enough type of victory matched the rest of the game. And we also used the normal enemies a lot. And this means that the player could use their knowledge of the rest of the game to be able to defeat the final boss. And it also meant that we could use the difficulty scaling of the enemies without any changes. It just removed tons and tons of work. So this wasn't a perfect solution, but it at least gave us the sort of high-level design that we were hoping for. So this process of coming up with something that would work and fit our high-level design took a long time to figure out, but basically we tried to figure out what we wanted the boss to feel like, and then and what the player to feel like while fighting it, and then we tried to figure out mechanics that would fit that feeling. So first we analyzed the high-level design, decided what we wanted to keep and what to change, And then we would just try things, trial and error. Does this work? Does this not work? Until we found something that fit our high-level design. So that's all the tips I have for you. Very often we don't follow these rules. They're not set in stone. These are just things that we've done in the past. And every team may approach design differently. But hopefully this gives you some insight into how we think about design, how we solve problems. Thank you, and thanks to Johnston for translating the slides, and I'm sure it made it a lot easier to understand. Thank you for having me.
Sure. 那我们非常谢谢Justin 的对我们的就是带来的讲说这样子。那现在如果有民众有任何问题的话，都可以举手。那我们会把麦克风递给你，然后让你就直接做 Q&A 的时间这样子。那有任何人有问题吗？
All right, first of all, thank you very much for the talk. And the question I have for you today doesn't really concern the talk directly, but I mainly wanted to know that when you were working on FTL with your partner, you were working in a team primarily of 2, but how did you manage to deal with situations that usually have a dedicated staff member to attend to, with stuff like finances, law, and maybe PR and marketing?
Yeah, we just have to do those things. Basically, at all times when you're working on something, some problem can happen. For example, Windows 10 updated and it broke FTL, and then we said, okay, I guess we're going to make no progress on Into the Breach for 2 weeks. So that stuff happens, and it would be better if we hired someone, but in general, yeah, we just have to do those things ourselves, and we don't like that part of development. I don't find that fun, so that's why we sort of like do things like this and give talks and do the game and then hide in a cave and just work by ourselves and talk to nobody, and so it's just this ebb and flow of business stuff and development stuff. And also, you could always email me or something too if we don't run out of time, if you have questions.
How do you know you're satisfied with the design and you can move on to the completion of the content?
So I get really invested. When I come up with an idea and I really like it, I just think about it all day. Honestly, most of the time, it would be Matt, who is just like, one day in the morning, he says, I don't think this is working. And then we just throw out everything and start over. And so when he doesn't say that, we just keep going. And eventually, though, I mean, we talk about it all the time, and eventually we're just like, well, it isn't broken yet, so I guess it works. And so we just keep trying, and then like, yeah, it's still not broken, so I guess this is what we're doing. There's no, this is it, guys, we solved it. Never does it feel like that.
All right, I thought of another question I felt like asking, which is, when you were making Into the Breach, you took extra careful care to make sure that the game was kept secret until you were comfortable before it was announced. But during development, when you were trying to figure out what worked and what didn't, was it just you and Matt who just tried it and played over and over again by yourselves and tried to figure out if something works or not, or were you able to get second opinions from someone else?
So for some background with FTL, we worked on our own, and then we did a Kickstarter, and then suddenly we had 5,000 people, and we had to give them updates and tell them things, and that was kind of dramatic and traumatizing. So with Into the Breach, we didn't want to do that. So most of the time, it was just Matt and I. Our partners and some close friends would try it. Most of our friends used up all of their goodwill on FTL and didn't want to help us anymore. But there's a couple guys who helped. I also would just show it to a couple people basically once a year or twice a year at GDC and at PAX. There's like a couple people that'd be like, here, just play this and tell me what you think. But other than that, it was only in the last year that we like had a Discord group and had like 30 testers who would just try it every day. I don't suggest people to do it this way. We're very much like, the way we like to design is, I want to make a game that I like. And the reason why that is because that's how FTL was developed, and we figured that worked, so let's just try that again. Let's just try and make something that we like, and if we like it, then somebody else will like it. And we are very hard on ourselves. We're very critical. Like I said, Matt, like it's very hard to impress Matt. So so we don't rely that much on testing, honestly. We don't have any, I don't even know the word, telemetrics. We don't like get feedback from the game from people online and stuff like that. Yeah, it's pretty simple.
You said you had difficulty levels Into the Breach. Well, the first question is why, and the second question is does it affect the AI or only like hit points and damage and those kind of things?
So it's very, the second question is easier. It's very simplistic, honestly. It doesn't affect AI. It doesn't affect damage. Every unit does the exact same thing. Basically, the only thing it affects is how many enemies there are. Because in this game, if there's 2 enemies and you have 3 units, it's very easy to prevent the damage. If you have 3, mechs and there's 5 enemies, it's very hard to prevent the damage. And just shifting 1 or 2 numbers, it makes huge differences. Why do we have the difficulty levels? It's because that people want something different out of the game. Different people want different things. Some people just want to fly through it and feel powerful. And some people want to bang their head against the wall and figure out, like, prove, I'll beat you, game, I'll show you, game. And honestly, with this game, more than FTL, like, playing it on easy, I think is still fun. I think even if you're better than the game, it's just a very different experience. It just feels less like trying to show off and more like I just enjoy feeling, a certain way in this game. Also, in general, with this game in particular, there is a huge breadth of skill levels in this game. There are some people who just see it, understand it, play it on hard, and they're fine. And then there's people who will say, I've spent 15 hours, 20 hours playing it on easy, and I cannot get past the first battle. And we generally don't like to force feed you like tutorials and stuff. And so we tried to make the gap between the difficulties wide enough so that you can at least get something out of the game no matter where you are. You can have your kid play it on easy and they do okay, maybe, I don't know. I personally, that's why we call the normal mode normal or whatever instead of medium, is because it's like this, especially with FTL, it's like this is what I think the game is. But I at least respect that other people have different opinions, what they want to get out of it. It's also a very low effort way if you have good difficulty scaling. It's a very low effort way to appeal to more people. It's like I just have to change a few numbers and suddenly all these other types of people like the game, which is very convenient. Anything else? Okay. There's one in the back too.
Just a question about cutting features. How did you deal actually with, first thing, was it always for the greater good? It's always cutting some things for making the games actually better? Or sometimes did you have to decide to cut things just because of the timing or anything like this, if you wanted to release it quicker? And how did you deal actually with cutting things? Was it always a good thing right away, or was it on the long term that it felt actually right?
With the first question, do we always cut the game for the greater good? No, we cut for every reason possible, because we feel like it, because anything could convince us that cutting is a good idea. Very often it was because we didn't think it would add to the game. More often, it was because it would just take too much effort, and we're like, this is not worth the time. Sometimes it's because we want to ship earlier, and other times it's because we're just sick of something. We're just like, go away. The second part was like hard and difficult, and sometimes it was very emotionally challenging. My wife tells me like this whole talk is basically about non-attachment, if you know, like Buddhist theory essentially, and how you basically don't get attached to your game design. I think we are naturally more in that direction. Like I am so attached to things in real life, but game design, I'm like, it doesn't work, throw it out, I don't care. So sometimes it's challenging to let go of something that I really like, but usually I just file it away as, oh, I'll try it again in some other game, which I know will never happen, but it makes me feel a little better, all in all. But yeah, it's always painful, but usually in an hour I feel like, oh, thank God we did that. Like, thank God I don't have to think about this anymore. It's gone. Yeah. I believe there's one in the back.
One thing you mentioned is that you should follow the fun. And would it have been more difficult for you to follow the fun if FTL wasn't such a huge success?
Oh, absolutely, yeah. The only reason why we were able to do any of this was because we didn't have to worry about money for our next game. We could take all the time we wanted. We could, you know, in between development, we basically spent a year just sort of messing around with little prototypes and just having fun as much as possible in between doing porting or whatever. But yeah, no, that was a luxury, definitely. It also is a big function of how small our team is. Like, I don't think it would be possible to get a team of 200 people to be okay with changes every day. And it was mostly because that Matt and I, just by chance, we are very similar thinkers. When we see a problem, we generally come to the same solution. So it makes it easy to just both agree, yeah, okay, we should do something different. And very rarely do we get in a situation where one of us says, no, we have to keep this, and the other says, no, we have to get rid of it. And that is just pure luck. And everybody else who's involved in the game doesn't really get to decide. So it's just pretty much us two making those tough decisions. Obviously, we care about things that other people invested their time in, but in general, we don't even bring on other people until we're certain we won't cut their stuff. Okay. Yeah, so the last question, I guess.
Hi. Are you a fan of Evangelion?
Evangelion?
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you.
That was easy. All right, thanks, guys. I'll be outside for a while if you want to chat and come say hi.
那我们再次掌声，就是谢谢讲师。